On our first wedding anniversary, everything fell apart. My mother-in-law stood up in front of everyone and accused me of stealing her luxury gold watch. My husband silenced the room, demanding I return it immediately. Furious, I shouted, "How dare you accuse me?" But before I could say more, he struck me hard across the face and called the police. I was dragged away in handcuffs while they laughed at my humiliation. But they never expected what happened next, because I came back the very next day with a surprise that turned their world upside down. My name is Sophia, and this is the story of how my life took a turn I could never have imagined. It all started 2 years ago when I married Ethan. I was 28, full of hope, and madly in love. Ethan, a 30-year-old banker, seemed like the perfect partner, kind, supportive, and driven. I had inherited a beautiful house from my parents, and the thought of starting a life together in that home felt like the beginning of a fairy tale. At first, everything seemed perfect. Ethan and I settled into the house, and for a while, it was just the two of us. Then came Margaret, Ethan's mother. Margaret, a wealthy socialite with a penchant for control, decided to move into the guest suite temporarily. She said it was to help us adjust to married life. But looking back, I realize it was her first step in asserting dominance over our lives. Margaret was not an easy woman to please. She had a way of making you feel small without ever raising her voice. At every turn, she criticized me, my cooking, my decorating, even the way I handled household finances. "Sophia," she'd say with a sharp tone, "you really think this shade of blue suits the living room? It's so juvenile." Ethan would laugh it off, telling me not to take her too seriously, but her words cut deep. I tried my best to keep the peace, thinking things would improve with time. But Margaret's presence only grew more oppressive. Every decision I made was questioned, and Ethan, to my dismay, rarely took my side. "She's just trying to help," he'd say, brushing off my concerns. I began to feel like an outsider in my own home. The first year of our marriage was a test of endurance. Every day felt like walking on eggshells around Margaret, who seemed to enjoy finding new ways to assert her control. Ethan's passive nature made things worse. He was so easily swayed by his mother that I often wondered if he even noticed how unhappy I was. But I loved him, and I held on, hoping things would change. Then came our first wedding anniversary, a day I had envisioned as a celebration of love and resilience. Ethan and I decided to host a grand party at our home. Margaret was, of course, heavily involved in the planning. "Leave it to me," she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. I wanted the day to be special, so I reluctantly let her take charge. The party was beautiful. Margaret spared no expense. Guests filled our home, laughing, dancing, and toasting to our one-year milestone. I almost felt happy. Then everything changed. It started subtly. Margaret's icy smile became more pronounced as the evening went on. She mingled with the guests, her voice just loud enough for me to hear snippets of her conversations. "Sophia's lucky to have Ethan," she'd say, her tone dripping with condescension. I ignored it, reminding myself that this was our celebration, not hers. Then, during dinner, she stood up, tapping her glass to get everyone's attention. "I have something important to say," she announced, her voice commanding silence in the room. I glanced at Ethan, who looked as puzzled as I felt. Margaret held up her wrist, bare except for a faint tan line where a watch had once been. "My luxury watch, a family heirloom, is missing," she said, her gaze landing squarely on me. My heart sank. "It was here this morning, and now it's gone." The guests exchanged uncomfortable glances, and I felt their eyes on me. "Sophia," Margaret continued, her voice cold, "you were the last person near my room. Do you know anything about this?" I stared at her, stunned. "No," I stammered. "I don't know what you're talking about." "I would never." "Don't lie," she snapped, her facade of politeness crumbling. "You've always been envious of our family's wealth. It's shameful." The room erupted in murmurs, and I felt like the walls were closing in. I turned to Ethan, desperate for support. "Ethan, you know I didn't do this." But he didn't defend me. Instead, he stood up, his face a mix of anger and embarrassment. Sophia, he said, his voice harsh, if you took it, return it now. Don't make this worse. I didn't take anything. I cried, tears streaming down my face. How can you believe this? Ethan's response was swift and shocking. In front of everyone, he struck me hard across the face. Gasps filled the room as I staggered backward, clutching my cheek. Enough lies, he shouted. I'll call the police. Before I could process what was happening, the police arrived. Ethan accused me of theft, and despite my protests, they handcuffed me and led me out of my own home. The last thing I saw before the doors closed behind me was Margaret's triumphant smirk and Ethan's cold, unforgiving eyes. As I sat in the police car, tears blurring my vision, one thought burned in my mind. This was not the life I had signed up for. I had been betrayed by the man I loved and humiliated in front of everyone. But deep inside, a spark of determination began to flicker. They had taken everything from me, my dignity, my home, my trust, but I wasn't going to let them win. This was only the beginning. The night I was taken away by the police felt like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. The humiliation of being handcuffed in front of family, friends, and strangers still burned in my memory. Margaret's smirk and Ethan's indifference haunted me. Sitting in the cold interrogation room, I realized I was completely alone. The police officers questioned me for hours. They asked if I had stolen the watch, if I had any grudges against my mother-in-law, and where I had been that day. Over and over, I insisted on my innocence, but their skeptical looks told me they didn't believe me. They even searched my belongings, as if the watch would magically appear in my purse or pockets. Of course, they found nothing. The humiliation deepened. Eventually, they let me go due to lack of evidence, but the damage was already done. I walked out of the station in the early hours of the morning, dazed and shattered. I wanted to go home, but where was home now? My house, my inheritance, had been claimed by Ethan and Margaret as if it had never belonged to me. I ended up at a small motel, feeling more lost than I ever had in my life. Sitting on the edge of the bed, I stared at my reflection in the cracked mirror. My cheek was still red and swollen from Ethan's slap. The pain was a cruel reminder of how far things had spiraled out of control. How had I ended up here? How had I let them do this to me? For the next few days, I drifted through life in a fog. Calls from friends and family flooded my phone, most of them gossiping about what had happened. Nobody offered real support, just curiosity wrapped in thin layers of concern. I didn't answer. What could I say? That my husband had turned on me, that I'd been framed, that I'd lost everything? I didn't want their pity. I needed a plan. Then, like a cruel joke, I received an eviction notice. Even though the house was legally mine, Ethan had manipulated the situation and transferred ownership to himself. He used our marriage as a weapon to take what my parents had left me. The notice was my breaking point. I wasn't just hurt anymore, I was furious. They had humiliated me, stolen my home, and tried to paint me as a thief. But I wasn't going to let them win. Something inside me shifted that day. I wasn't going to be their victim. I was going to fight back. The first step was filing a police report against Ethan and Margaret. I walked into the same station where I had been interrogated and told the officers everything. I told them how Margaret had falsely accused me, how Ethan had struck me, and how they had fraudulently taken over my inheritance. The officers listened, but I could see the doubt in their eyes. It was obvious they thought it was just a domestic squabble. But I wasn't going to let them dismiss me. This isn't just about me, I said firmly. It's about justice. They've stolen everything I have, and I can prove it. That's when I was introduced to Detective Laura Reed, a no-nonsense investigator who immediately took my case seriously. Laura was in her early 40s, sharp and methodical, with a calm demeanor that put me at ease. She promised to look into my claims, but warned me that it would take time to build a case.
They sound clever, she said.
But clever people leave trails. Over the next few weeks, Laura and her team worked tirelessly. They combed through financial records, legal documents, and witness statements. I provided them with everything I had, emails, bank statements, even texts from Ethan that hinted at his plans to take control of the house. It was a slow and grueling process, but I felt a sense of purpose for the first time in weeks. During this time, I also began to regain my confidence. I found support in unexpected places, like the kind woman who ran the motel I was staying in. Her name was Maria, and she offered me warm meals and words of encouragement when I needed them most. "You're stronger than you think," she said one evening. "Don't let them take that away from you." One day, Laura called me with a breakthrough. "Sophia," she said, her voice tinged with excitement, "we've found something. Ethan and Margaret have been siphoning money from your accounts into a separate trust. They've been covering their tracks well, but we have enough evidence to proceed." Hearing those words felt like a lifeline. For the first time, I saw a glimmer of hope. Laura explained that they would need more time to build an airtight case, but I was finally starting to see the cracks in Ethan and Margaret's perfect facade. It wasn't just about the money or the house anymore. It was about reclaiming my life and standing up for myself. They had tried to destroy me, but I was still standing. And I wasn't going to stop until I saw them face justice. As the days turned into weeks, I prepared myself for what was to come. The case was getting stronger, but I knew Ethan and Margaret wouldn't go down without a fight.
I was ready for them.
For the first time in months, I felt a sense of control. They had underestimated me, and soon, they would regret it. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about revenge. The weeks that followed were some of the most challenging of my life, but they were also filled with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in a long time. Detective Laura Reed and her team worked tirelessly to uncover the truth. Every new piece of evidence they found felt like a small victory, a step closer to reclaiming what had been stolen from me. Laura kept me updated regularly, and each time we met, she brought news that strengthened the case. One day, she sat across from me in her small, cluttered office and slid a folder across the desk. "Sophia, this is big," she said. "We've traced significant amounts of money being transferred from your personal accounts to an offshore account linked to Ethan." I opened the folder and saw the damning evidence laid out in black and white. Ethan had been systematically stealing from me, using our shared accounts to funnel my inheritance into his name. I felt a mix of anger and relief. It was painful to see how far he'd gone to betray me, but it was also proof that I wasn't imagining things. Laura leaned back in her chair, her sharp eyes studying me. "We're also looking into Margaret's involvement. From what we've gathered, she's been orchestrating this from the start. She manipulated Ethan and used him to do her dirty work." Hearing that confirmed what I had always suspected. Margaret had never accepted me, and she had done everything in her power to tear me down. But now, the tables were starting to turn. As the investigation continued, I found myself reflecting on my marriage. How had I not seen this coming? How had I allowed Ethan and Margaret to take control of my life? The truth was, I had been so blinded by love that I ignored the red flags. Ethan's inability to stand up to his mother, Margaret's constant belittling, it was all there from the beginning. I just didn't want to see it. One evening, as I sat in my motel room, I received a call from Laura. "Sophia," she said, her voice serious, "we've found something else. Ethan and Margaret have been trying to sell the house. They've listed it under a fake name to avoid suspicion." My heart sank. The house wasn't just a building to me. It was the last piece of my parents' legacy. The thought of them profiting from it made my blood boil. "Can we stop them?" I asked, my voice trembling with anger. "Yes," Laura said firmly. "We've already filed an injunction to freeze the sale. They can't touch the property until this case is resolved." That was the moment I realized how important it was to keep fighting. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about protecting my parents' memory and ensuring that Ethan and Margaret didn't get away with their cruelty. The next major breakthrough came when Laura's team uncovered emails between Ethan and Margaret. In these emails, Margaret explicitly instructed Ethan on how to manipulate me into signing over the house. Her words were cold and calculating, with no regard for the damage they were causing. "You see, Sophia," Laura said as she showed me the emails, "this isn't just about fraud. It's about emotional abuse, too. They planned this from the start." I felt a surge of anger as I read Margaret's words. She had always presented herself as a sophisticated, well-mannered woman, but these emails revealed her true nature. She was a schemer, a manipulator, and a liar. And now, the world would see her for who she really was. The case finally went to court, and I was both nervous and determined. Walking into that courtroom was one of the hardest things I'd ever done, but I knew I had no choice. Ethan and Margaret were there, sitting smugly at the defendant's table. Margaret's cold gaze met mine, and I could see the disdain in her eyes. Ethan looked uneasy, but he avoided making eye contact with me. The trial was intense. Laura and her team presented the evidence meticulously, leaving no room for doubt. They showed the financial records, the forged documents, and the incriminating emails. Witnesses were called, including friends and acquaintances who testified about Margaret's manipulative behavior and Ethan's questionable actions. Sitting in that courtroom, I felt a mix of emotions. There were moments when I wanted to cry, moments when I wanted to scream, and moments when I felt an overwhelming sense of pride. This was my fight, and I was finally taking back control. One of the most powerful moments came when Laura cross-examined Margaret. "Mrs. Connors," she said, her voice calm but firm, "can you explain why you accused Sophia of stealing your watch when no evidence of theft was ever found?" Margaret faltered, her composed facade cracking. I believed she had taken it," she stammered. "Believed?" Laura pressed. "Or was it a convenient way to humiliate her and justify taking over her assets?" Margaret's silence spoke volumes. The courtroom was tense, and I could feel the eyes of the jury shifting toward her with judgment. By the time the trial concluded, I knew the tide had turned. The evidence was overwhelming, and the jury saw through their lies. The prosecutor gave a closing statement that left no room for doubt. Ethan and Margaret were guilty of fraud, theft, and emotional abuse. The judge delivered the verdict swiftly. Both Ethan and Margaret were found guilty and sentenced to prison. My assets, including the house, were to be returned to me immediately. As the verdict was announced, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. I had won, but more than that, I had reclaimed my dignity. This wasn't just a legal victory, it was a personal one. For the first time in a long time, I felt strong, empowered, and ready to start anew. The fight was over, but my journey was just beginning. As the courtroom emptied and the final echoes of the gavel faded, I sat still, letting the weight of everything settle. It was over. Ethan and Margaret were led away in handcuffs, their smugness replaced with disbelief and fear. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of peace. Laura approached me, a satisfied smile on her face. "You did it, Sophia," she said, placing a reassuring hand on my shoulder. "They got what they deserved." "Thank you," I replied, my voice steady, but filled with emotion. "I couldn't have done this without you." Leaving the courthouse that day, I realized how much had changed. I had started this journey broken and humiliated, but now I felt stronger than I ever thought possible. Justice had been served, and the pieces of my life were finally starting to come back together. Underscore 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 underscore. The days that followed were filled with small victories. The house, my parents' legacy, was officially returned to me. Walking through its halls again was bittersweet. The memories of the betrayal that took place there were hard to ignore, but I was determined to reclaim it as my own. The first thing I did was redecorate, erasing every trace of Ethan and Margaret's presence. Each brushstroke of paint and every new piece of furniture felt like a step toward healing. Financially, I was back on stable ground. The court ordered the return of all the money Ethan had siphoned from my accounts. It wasn't just about the money, it was about restoring what was rightfully mine. With each account balance restored, I felt a little closer to reclaiming the independence I had lost. But the most important victory was emotional. For so long, I had let Ethan and Margaret's manipulation define me. Their betrayal had left scars, but now, Those scars felt more like badges of resilience. I wasn't the same person I had been when I married Ethan, and that was a good thing. One afternoon, as I sat in my favorite armchair overlooking the garden, Laura called. "Sophia," she said, her voice warm. "I just wanted to check in. How are you doing?" "I'm good," I said, surprised at the truth of my own words. "Better than I thought I'd be." "I'm glad to hear that," she replied. "You've come a long way." We talked for a while, and as I hung up, I realized how grateful I was, not just for Laura's help, but for the journey that had brought me here. It hadn't been easy, but it had taught me more about myself than I ever thought possible. A few weeks later, I decided to do something I hadn't done in a long time: celebrate. I invited close friends and the few family members who had supported me through the ordeal to a small gathering at the house. It wasn't a grand party like the one Margaret had orchestrated. It was intimate and heartfelt, a celebration of new beginnings. As the evening progressed, I stood in the garden, watching my friends laugh and enjoy themselves. The air was warm, and the scent of blooming flowers filled the space. For the first time in a long time, I felt at home, not just in the house, but in my own life. Maria, the motel owner who had shown me so much kindness, approached me with a smile. "You look happy, Sophia," she said. "You deserve this." "I do, don't I?" I replied, surprising myself with my confidence. Months passed, and life began to feel normal again. I threw myself into work, taking on new clients and projects that reignited my passion for design. Slowly, I started to dream again, not of a life I had once planned with Ethan, but of a future that was entirely my own. One day, I came across a photo of myself and Ethan, taken during the early days of our relationship. I stared at it for a moment, expecting to feel anger or sadness. Instead, I felt nothing but a quiet resolve. That chapter of my life was over, and I had emerged stronger. Looking back now, I see that the betrayal I endured was a turning point, not just in my life, but in who I am. It taught me the value of resilience, the importance of fighting for what's right, and the strength that comes from standing up for yourself. It wasn't the path I would have chosen, but it led me to a place of self-discovery and empowerment. I'm no longer the woman who let others control her life. I'm Sophia, a woman who fought back, reclaimed her dignity, and built a new life on her own terms. And for that, I am proud. This is my story, and it's only the beginning. My brother generously offered us the chance to live at his place without the burden of rent or utilities, and we're relying on you, Amber, to take care of everything. I'm employed in the finance sector, and my husband, let's call him Michael, repairs cars. We currently reside in the house where I was raised, which is no longer occupied by my parents, but now functions as a family-run business, previously managed by my father. My brother, who was groomed to succeed my dad, pursued economics in college. He further honed his skills by studying business management at Oxford University abroad. After returning to the USA, he collaborated with our father for some time. Eventually, when our parents decided to retire to Snowmass Village for a tranquil life amidst nature, my brother took the reins of the family business. Subsequently, the family home was passed down to me. My husband and I moved in, appreciating its excellent location, just an 8-minute walk from the train station and conveniently close to public transport, making access to shops, hospitals, and schools effortless. It's reassuring to know that everything we need is within reach as our children grow up and start their own lives. We were excited about expanding our family and enjoying life here, but unexpected challenges arose soon after moving in. My mother-in-law frequently visits, driven by curiosity about my parents' business and its worth. Her inquiries often tread into uncomfortable territory, like asking, "Hey Amber, what's the deal with your parents' money? How much will you inherit?" I find these questions distasteful and try to deflect them with a laugh, saying, "I'm not sure. I haven't given it much thought. I already own the house, so there might not be much else." Despite my attempts to lighten the mood, She persists, ominously hinting, "They're getting older. You never know what might happen." My mother-in-law seemed overly focused on my parents' financial status, almost as if she were counting on inheriting their wealth herself. Even though I was aware of what I might inherit, I chose to keep it to myself, not wanting to divulge any details to her or even my husband, who is quite close to her. However, one surprising holiday morning at about 7 a.m., our day took an unexpected turn. The doorbell rang, and when I opened the door, a group of movers greeted me. To my shock, my mother-in-law and my brother-in-law's family had decided to move in without any prior notice. They entered our home with broad smiles, cheerfully announcing that they were moving in. Their overly bright enthusiasm sent shivers down my spine. Turning to my husband for some sort of explanation, he simply shrugged and dismissively said, "What's the big deal? Mom and the others can stay here. We've got plenty of space." He seemed unfazed by the sudden intrusion. I was still reeling from the surprise of this new living arrangement when my sister-in-law casually dropped a bombshell. She claimed that our brother had invited them and that they wouldn't need to worry about rent or bills. At that point, my brother-in-law started picking out rooms as if he were at a hotel, even instructing Michael to move our things into the hallway to make space. The situation rapidly became overwhelming, and it felt as though they were claiming my house as their own, taking over rooms without hesitation. My mother-in-law and sister-in-law's family had been pushing boundaries for quite some time, with my sister-in-law even going through my personal belongings without permission. It seemed they might even try to claim my room next. I had reached my breaking point. This is my home, and their behavior made it seem as if they had ownership over it. I'm usually calm and collected, but watching these people treat my family home, left to me by my parents, as if it were their property was too much. That's why I finally raised my voice, firmly telling them it was time for everyone to leave. The invasion of my personal space and the blatant disrespect for my sanctuary pushed me to act out of character and demand they respect my home. But then something totally unexpected happened. "How dare you speak to us like that? You're the one who needs to leave." With those words still hanging in the air, I felt a sharp sting on my cheek. Had I really just been slapped? It took a moment for the reality to sink in as I stood there, stunned, feeling the throbbing pain. At that moment, something inside me snapped. I couldn't tolerate living with people who showed such blatant disrespect. This house was mine, and I wouldn't let anyone treat it like their personal playground. I quickly decided to leave, packing my things and preparing to inform my family about what had transpired. Needing some space and a fresh start, I rented an apartment further from work, even though it meant a longer commute. When I called my parents to explain the situation, I could hear the anger in their voices, especially my dad's. He had always been a pillar of support, both as a CEO and as a father. Although I didn't want to involve my soon-to-retire parents in this turmoil, I felt I had no other choice. My right to my inherited home was being challenged, and I needed to take a stand. While settling into the new apartment, I was certain that my husband and his family were making themselves comfortable back at my house. Driven by advice from my brother and father, I decided to take decisive action. A few days later, during a work break, I checked my phone to find it flooded with missed calls and messages from my husband. His response to the latest developments was clear. I had made arrangements to have the water and electricity cut off at the house. Since everything there depended on electricity, this move was sure to get their attention and underscore the seriousness of the situation. I was determined to reclaim what was rightfully mine and remind everyone that there were consequences to their actions. We hadn't gotten around to installing solar panels yet, and without electricity, dealing with the heat must have been quite a struggle. My husband's repeated calls were likely about this very predicament. As I was contemplating ignoring another call, he rang again, this time perfectly timed during my break. "Hey, what's happening?" There's no electricity and the water's not running. Did you turn off the utilities? His voice was tinged with panic. Given that the house was in my name and I was no longer residing there, I felt it made sense to cut off the utilities. Why should I foot the bill for a house I wasn't living in? So yes, I had the utilities shut off. My husband, however, was furious, demanding that I restore the services immediately. But just because he wanted the utilities back didn't mean I would comply. If they wanted utilities, they should manage that with their own finances, especially since they often reminded me that it was my house, implying that I should bear the costs. Their words didn't match their actions, and I felt no obligation to renew the contracts or pay for their comfort. Firm in my decision, I ended the call as my break wrapped up. Soon after, my mother-in-law, sister-in-law, and brother-in-law each called me separately, all voicing their complaints about the lack of electricity and water. They lamented over how unbearably hot and uncomfortable their rooms were, and how inconvenient life was without running water. Their grievances only reinforced my resolve not to cave to their demands. I maintained my stance that if they were unhappy, they were welcome to leave the house. But those were their problems, not mine. After listening to their complaints, I firmly told them to sort out the issues themselves and ended the calls. I thought they were just being greedy and expected that they would give up and leave soon. However, even after a week, there were no signs of them moving out. Realizing they might stay indefinitely, I decided to escalate the situation. I sought advice from my father's company lawyer and requested that he draft a notice for my husband and the others. The notice accused them of trespassing. They had entered my property without permission, effectively forcing me out, and now occupied it as if it were their own. I warned all four of them that I was considering legal action. The notion of receiving a lawyer's letter took my husband aback. Clearly unprepared for such a firm response from me, he approached me hoping to negotiate a compromise. I understood that their reputation was important to them and that the threat of a lawsuit would be daunting. They wanted to avoid legal issues, but also didn't want to abandon their comfortable setup, likely hoping to persuade me to let them stay. I could see right through my husband's intentions, but despite this, I refused to entertain their pleas. My refusal pushed my husband to the edge. In the heat of a workday, he lost his temper and shouted at me over the phone, demanding that I retract the lawyer's notice and back down. His outburst, however, did not sway me. In fact, it only served to irritate me further. I thought to myself, who do you think you are, taking over someone else's house? No matter how loudly he protested, my mind was made up. If they insisted on squatting there, I was ready to take legal action. Think carefully before you act, I warned him, but despite his continued yelling, I paid him no attention and hung up the phone. Engaging further seemed like a waste of time. After discussing the possibility of divorce with my lawyer, I returned home to find missed calls from my mother-in-law and sister-in-law. I suspected they wanted to talk about settling the dispute, but I was done with confrontations and decided to block their numbers to stop the calls. This act of drawing clear boundaries seemed to underscore the seriousness of the situation for my husband's family. Unable to face the looming legal actions, they eventually packed up and left the house. With the involvement of the lawyer, my divorce proceedings moved forward smoothly. I hired a cleaning service to rejuvenate the house, and once they were done, I was finally able to enjoy the comfort of being back in my freshly tidied home. Living apart from my husband's family in a rented apartment was manageable, but it was nothing compared to the serenity of being in my own space. Even though the house showed signs of wear, I was planning a renovation soon. My dad recommended a reliable contractor for the job. Being on my own felt surprisingly liberating. I could lounge on the couch without being judged and eat whatever I wanted without criticism. Just as I was settling into this newfound independence, I received a call from a number I didn't recognize. At first, I ignored it, thinking it might be the contractor, but the persistent ringing eventually compelled me to answer. It was my ex-husband, whom I had not spoken to since our separation 5 months ago. The sound of his voice immediately dampened my mood. After finalizing our divorce and agreeing to cease all contact through legal channels, I was puzzled by his call, especially since he had changed his number. Before I could end the call, he interjected with a plea. "Please, just listen for a moment. I'm desperate." Reluctantly, I stayed on the line. He then shared that his company was undergoing financial difficulties, resulting in a potential pay cut. Moreover, his mother's health was declining, rendering her unable to work. To compound the situation, my sister-in-law and her husband were struggling financially, with him being unemployed. My sister-in-law was juggling multiple part-time jobs just to make ends meet, with most of her income going toward paying off her husband's debts. Meanwhile, my ex-husband explained that he was facing a pay cut, making their financial situation even more precarious. As they shared their difficulties, all I could respond with was a detached, "Okay, I see." These were the same people who had invaded my home, ignored my rights, and tried to force me out. It was hard to feel any sympathy for them. Their problems were their own. My ex-husband's desperation grew as he pleaded. "Please, don't turn your back on us. We're on the brink here. We might not have a roof over our heads or food on the table tomorrow. Remember, we used to be family. Can't you help us?" His voice cracked, verging on tears. But I remained unmoved. During my difficult times, he had offered no support and had sided with my mother-in-law, who had constantly belittled me. Just like her, my sister-in-law and brother-in-law had looked down on me, mocking my appearance and traditional values, dismissing me as old-fashioned. Their insults had cut deep, and they showed no remorse. Furthermore, my mother-in-law had worsened matters by pressuring me to conceive, subjecting me to strange remedies, scheduling unnecessary doctor's visits, and spreading rumors about my supposed infertility. Reflecting on my marriage, I saw no redeeming qualities. My ex-husband, once caring, had become a puppet under his mother's control. After we married, there was an incident where my mother-in-law barged into our home while I was out for an appointment. She expressed disappointment to my ex-husband, saying, "I wanted to see Amber, but she wasn't here. I want us to be friends, but I'm saddened." Upon hearing his mother's distress, my ex-husband lashed out at me without even considering my side of the story, influenced by her claims of wanting to get along. This history made it clear that engaging further would only draw me back into their chaos, something I had worked hard to escape. My mother-in-law's criticism was relentless. "Has my son lost weight because your cooking is so terrible?" she would say, loud enough for anyone nearby to hear, whether we were at home or out in public. Together with my sister-in-law and brother-in-law, they formed a united front against me, eliminating any chance for a peaceful relationship. I realized I could no longer tolerate their behavior. "No matter what you say, my decision is final. I can't help you," I declared firmly during the call. "I'm ending this call now, and I don't want to hear from you again." With that, I hung up and immediately blocked the new number. Knowing my ex-husband, he might try to change his number to contact me again, so I made plans to change my number over the weekend. However, before I could make the change, they blatantly violated the lawyer's agreement. At 10 p.m., they showed up at my door, demanding entry and assistance. "Open the door. We're family. You should take care of us," they shouted, banging loudly and causing a disturbance late at night. "What's going on at this hour?" "Please go home. You're disturbing the neighbors," I pleaded through the intercom. But they ignored me, continuing to create a ruckus. Feeling overwhelmed by their unruly behavior, I was contemplating calling the police when suddenly, sirens blared from outside. It appeared a neighbor had already alerted the authorities. Startled by the approaching police, my ex-husband's family assumed I had made the call and tried to flee, but they were quickly encircled by onlookers, leaving them with no escape route. Soon, the officers arrived and escorted them to the police station. I provided a detailed account of the incident when questioned by the police. Word of the disturbance spread quickly through the neighborhood, reaching a colleague of my ex-husband who was among the spectators. By the next day, the whole office was abuzz with the story. Already dealing with the repercussions of a pay cut, my ex-husband's troubles multiplied when his company learned of his involvement in the police incident. He lost his job and couldn't afford his rent, leading to strained relations with his sister's family and the collapse of their shared living arrangement. Now, Michael and his mother were compelled to relocate to public housing, where both of them took on several part-time jobs to make ends meet. In a desperate effort to add to their income, his mother also entered the part-time workforce.
I should have known something was terribly wrong the moment Derek abruptly ended his phone call and shoved his cell into his pocket, his face taut with tension. My husband had been taking an abnormal number of private calls lately, always stepping away to murmur furtively like he had some big secret to hide. As he rejoined me on the living room couch, I studied his expression, trying to gauge his mood. "Everything okay, babe?" I ventured carefully. "You've seemed preoccupied lately." Derek avoided my gaze, letting out a strained chuckle. "It's nothing, Lena, just some dumb thing at work, that's all." His fingers tapped an agitated rhythm on the couch cushion as he forced a tight smile. "So what did you want to talk about?" Something in the pit of my stomach twisted sharply, warning me that he was hiding something serious. But I opted not to push further, at least not yet. "Well, I was hoping we could discuss our savings plan for the nursery remodel. Have you had a chance to look at the contractor quotes I emailed you?" His body stiffened, and those telltale worry lines creased his forehead. "About that," he began slowly, "I've been meaning to mention that I talked to my mom recently. She thinks we should hold off on the remodel for now." I blinked, struggling to comprehend. "What? Why would she say that?" A tendril of dread began unfurling in my chest. "She just thinks it's unwise to sink so much money into renovations with the way things are so uncertain right now," Derek said evasively. "The economy and all, you know. Maybe we should play it safe for a while." My pulse quickened as realization dawned. "Wait. Does this have something to do with that big opportunity your mom wants you to invest in?" I demanded, unable to conceal the sharpness in my tone. "The one you two have been so secretive about." Derek frowned, suddenly looking dismayed, like a child caught with his hand in the cookie jar. "Now, Lena, don't get worked up. It's just a little side business venture that could really pay off big in the long run." "That little venture is blowing through our life savings behind my back." I shot back, anger and betrayal roiling inside me, while I'm over here thinking we're on the same team, planning for our baby's future. Lurching to my feet, I paced in short, agitated bursts, my voice rising in incredulous disbelief. "I can't believe you'd let your mother manipulate you into gambling away everything we've worked for, all for some shady get-rich-quick scheme she's peddling." Derek stood as well, palms raised in a placating gesture as he took a step towards me. "Lena, calm down, okay? You're overreacting. Mom knows what she's doing. This investment is rock solid. Once we get the payoff, we'll be sitting pretty. No more money worries." I stared at the man I'd naively thought was my loving partner, unable to recognize him in that moment. How could I have been so blind to the truth slowly unraveling before my eyes? As if on cue, Derek's phone buzzed again with another incoming call, no doubt from his manipulative puppet master. The harsh reality slammed into me with sickening clarity. My husband's heart and loyalty no longer belonged to me. Not really. I was just another piece on the board, another player for Evelyn to control and subjugate through her web of lies and scheme. And I had a terrible feeling that her games were only just beginning. The weeks that followed were a waking nightmare. Evelyn's rock-solid investment predictably imploded in spectacular fashion, draining our life savings in what amounted to an elaborate financial shakedown. As Derek broke the devastating news, the fury etched in his expression made it clear where he placed the blame. "I can't believe you let this happen," he erupted, spit flying. "If you had just been supportive instead of fighting me every step, none of this would have gone south." I gaped at him, stunned by the venom and audacity of his misdirected rage. Before I could formulate a reply, the doorbell rang with the shrill, incessant ringing that could only be Evelyn. Derek threw up his hands and stormed off to let his mother in. The moment she swept into the living room in a floral moo-moo, her beady eyes lasered in on me with piercing accusation. "Well, I should have known," she tutted, shaking her head slowly. "We had a good thing going, and you just couldn't keep your doubts to yourself, could you?" Bewildered, I opened and closed my mouth, momentarily robbed of speech. I never said anything to undermine." "Oh, don't play dumb with me, Lena," Evelyn sneered, waddling closer until I could smell her stale cream puff breath. "If you had been fully on board, lending your undivided support, my son's venture would have succeeded." Derek hovered behind his mother, nodding in sullen agreement. The sight of my own husband siding against me, drinking in his mother's toxic lies, was like a vice around my heart. I drew myself up as tall as I could manage, anger and defiance coursing through me. "That's a loop and you know it, Evelyn. This had nothing to do with me. The feds were onto your shady scheme from the start." Evelyn's eyes flashed with undisguised malice. For a fleeting moment, I thought she might actually strike me before she caught herself. Everything has gone wrong because of you," she seethed, jabbing her pink sausage finger aggressively into my chest. I flinched at the vehemence of her tirade, my hand instinctively cradling my still flat abdomen, protecting the life growing inside me. Derek regarded my gesture with apparent disdain. "Yeah, great going, Lena. Way to start our family off on the right track. Flat broke, all because you couldn't have a little faith in us." The cruelty and callousness of his words sliced deep. How had I fallen so far from the man I thought I knew? Trusted and loved, even? Before my tortured thoughts could run away from me, Evelyn's reedy cackle pierced the tension. "Oh, don't worry, Derry," she cooed, patting his arm in a show of oily reassurance. "This is just a temporary setback. We just need to rethink our strategy, that's all." Her flinty gaze settled on me again, glinting with an unmistakable malice. Whatever her twisted agenda entailed, I knew one thing with chilling certainty. I would never be free of Evelyn's manipulative venom. Not unless I fought back with every last ounce and cunning I could muster. As much as the prospect sickened me, I realized that only one of us would emerge victorious from the grim battle looming ahead. For the sake of my unborn child's future, I had no choice but to ensure that victory would belong to me. In a desperate bid to salvage what remained of my fracturing marriage, I suggested Derek and I look into couples counseling. To my surprise, he didn't immediately balk at the idea. "You know what? You might be onto something there," he said, tone uncharacteristically agreeable. "This whole mess has been really hard on both of us. Maybe having an objective third party could help get our relationship back on track." I nodded, tentatively hopeful at his willingness. "I think it's exactly what we need to work through this and move forward as partners. For the baby's sake." Derek's expression clouded briefly at the mention of the baby, that same flickering hesitation I'd noticed whenever our child came up. But he pasted on a reassuring smile. "You're absolutely right. I'll make some calls. See about setting up our first session." True to his word, Derek booked our initial counseling appointment for the following week. But in the days leading up to it, his behavior shifted once more into that unsettling realm of secrecy and preoccupation. My suspicions escalated when he abruptly announced a last-minute business trip that would conveniently span our entire therapy window. "You're just going to blow off counseling after I agreed to it?" I challenged him, unable to hide my dismay. "Derek, we can't keep avoiding our problems forever. That's what got us into this mess to begin with." He dismissed my protestations with an airy wave. "Relax. It's just a little golf weekend with some potential clients. But you know what? You're right. Putting off counseling would be counterproductive. Why don't you come along?" My brow furrowed with confusion. "Come along? To your business trip?" "Sure. Could be fun." Derek replied with a disarming chuckle. We can use the resort's couples services, have some nice relaxing spa time while we're there. Maybe fit in a massage or two after my meetings each day. The jovial pitch put me immediately on guard. Derek acted entirely too eager, too polished in his sales patter. Like he was reciting from a carefully rehearsed script rather than being genuinely spontaneous. Against my better judgment, I hesitantly agreed to accompany him. Looking back, that singular lapse in discernment would ultimately serve as the tipping point that sent my life into irreversible freefall. The seaside resort we checked into appeared pleasant enough on its manicured surface. White sandy beaches, poolside cabanas, luxury spa amenities. But I couldn't shake an ominous pall lurking just beneath that postcard-ready facade. Those unshakable misgivings cemented into sheer dread when we made our way to the private bungalows where Derek claimed his meetings would be held. Because looming among the quaint cottages, her floral muumuu and pinched glower, unmistakable even from a distance, was the last person on earth I wanted to see right then. My scheming, conniving mother-in-law. And in that soul-withering moment when Derek's eyes met Evelyn's with a subtle, knowing nod, I realized too late that I had been lured into her latest trap, one from which there might be no escape. The hot, salty breeze stung my eyes as Derek and I approached the cluster of bungalows where Evelyn waited, her arms folded tightly in dissatisfied judgment. Several other figures milled about, solemn-faced men and women I didn't recognize. "What is this?" I hissed at Derek through a tight smile, desperately hoping this was all some misguided surprise he had planned. "Who are these people?" Before he could respond, Evelyn stepped forward, her expression a chilling mask of smug resolve. "Good, you're here," she said flatly. "We've been expecting you, Lena. It's time we had a long overdue reckoning." The words were ominous, layered with threatening undercurrents. My chest tightened as dread took hold. "Mother, maybe we should have some privacy to talk," Derek stammered, suddenly looking less certain than when we'd arrived. But Evelyn shushed him with a curt wave of her hand. "There will be no more talking in circles. We're done with niceties. It's time for the truth to finally come out, for Lena's own good." One of the other women, a stern-looking blonde in a pantsuit, cleared her throat. "Perhaps we should move this inside, where it will be contained." My heart pounded furiously as I was ushered into the nearest bungalow, sensing I had no choice but to cooperate, at least for now. The others filed in silently and arrayed themselves in a semicircle of hard-backed chairs facing a weathered love seat where I was instructed to sit. Evelyn assumed a position at the head of the makeshift assembly, her cold stare locking onto me. "You've been a source of negativity and strife from the moment you came into this family, Lena, poisoning my son's mind with your doubts and ingratitude time and again. It's why we currently find ourselves in such profound difficulties." The words seemed ludicrous, laughable in their sheer audacity, and yet they were delivered with such biting certainty that my rebuke withered on my lips. "Our objective today is to remedy that toxic influence through truth and accountability," Evelyn pressed on, undeterred. "We will persist until you acknowledge and confess your failings as a wife and soon-to-be mother. Only then can you atone and be reintegrated on the path of righteousness." The room blurred around me as the full, horrific realization crystallized. This wasn't merely some twisted reckoning in Evelyn's mind. It was a systematic attempt to break me, to strip away my identity and remake me in her own warped image. But I wouldn't go down without a fight. "You're the one who has poisoned this family," I spat out, struggling to keep my voice from shaking with rage and desperation. "With your lies and schemes, using Derek as your puppet to control me." "Lies?" Evelyn's eyes flashed with indignation. "The only lies here are the ones you've allowed into this family through your selfish resistance." In an instant, the others were on their feet, hurling their own accusations in a dizzying torrent of verbal lashings. I cringed back into the love seat as their voices rose in fervor, drowning me in wave after wave of recrimination and scorn. Somewhere in the chaos, Derek watched impassively, making no move to intercede or calm the escalating ambush, like a damning harbinger of where his true allegiances would forever lie, with his mother, no matter how depraved her manipulations. As the onslaught reached its fevered peak, something inside me fractured. I finally understood that there would be no victory for me here today, no matter how righteous my defiance. not against these overwhelming forces arrayed to systematically deconstruct my sense of self. The only way to escape from this nightmare was to play along, to acquiesce in hopes of surviving long enough to strike back later when I held the advantage. To live to fight another day, as much as that singular thought lacerated my very soul, even if that day might never come. I have no idea how long the harrowing intervention lasted. Time seemed to blur and distort as hours of psychological torment blended together. All I knew was that by the end, I was left utterly depleted, slumped in the love seat while flecks of spittle dried on my skin. Evelyn sneered victoriously as she proclaimed the session concluded. "Get some rest, Lena. We'll reconvene in the morning to accept your full confession." Still shaking, I watched through hollow eyes as her cabal of cohorts filed out. Only Derek remained behind, not quite meeting my gaze. I should have stopped them," he mumbled, sounding more like a sullen teenager than a grown man. "But you have to admit, you brought a lot of this on yourself, antagonizing Mom at every turn." The words lanced through what little remained of my tattered self-worth. I wanted to lash out, to rage and scream at this pitiful excuse for a man, but the futility of it rendered me mute. Without another word, Derek turned and left me alone in the dimly lit bungalow, shutting the door with a dull thud of finality. The desolate quiet that followed was somehow more oppressive than the torrent of verbal assaults I'd just endured. I'm not sure how long I remained there in that emaciated husk of a state, dwelling in my despair. But at some point, a faint inner voice sparked to life, almost inaudible at first. "You cannot give up now, not when so much is at stake." The thought crystallized like a revelation, focusing my fracturing psyche. Because Derek and his wretched mother were right about one thing. They had underestimated me. Seen me as weak, as a broken spirit ready to surrender completely. But in that moment, I tapped into a reserve of strength from somewhere deep inside. The part of me that drew from a primal well, a maternal drive to safeguard the innocent life gestating within me. My child's life. Almost mechanically, I rose from the love seat and surveyed my surroundings with new alertness. A sliver of pre-dawn light filtered through the bungalow's bay window, illuminating the outline of a heavy wooden chair propped beneath the latch. A security measure, no doubt to keep me contained. Inching towards the chair, I hefted its solid weight experimentally before hoisting it up and slamming it squarely into the window. The glass fractured in a satisfying spray of shards. I bashed at it again and again, undeterred even as my knuckles grew slick with blood. Sharpened determination propelled me until I had created an opening wide enough to slip through. The cool caress of morning beach air danced across my clammy skin as I hauled myself over the sill and dropped gracelessly onto the sand below, wincing at the bite of stray shards. My escape was far from assured, but sheer adrenaline fortified my battered body with a potent second wind. I sprinted away from the bungalow as fast as my legs could carry me, following the faint illumination of the rising sun towards the unknown. Freedom was still just a fragile hope glimmering on the horizon, but it was a future I would fight like hell to claim, one painstaking step after another, no matter how daunting the odyssey ahead might be. For the sake of my child, merely surviving was no longer an option. I would find a way to fight back and win. The days and weeks after my harrowing escape from that nightmare resort passed in a blur. Staying one step ahead of Derek and Evelyn's efforts to track me down consumed every waking moment. I couldn't risk going to the authorities, not yet. With their wealth and influence, they would surely turn it into a vicious custody battle that I might not win in my current delicate condition. No, I needed to play this smarter, gather insurmountable evidence of their depravity first. My parents took me in without question, offering shelter and lending what financial support they could. It shamed me to put them at risk by involving them at all, but I was out of options. During those tense months, I meticulously compiled documentation of every step of Derek and Evelyn's duplicitous campaign against me. Financials, witness testimony, surveillance photos, anything and everything that could be leveraged. There was no margin for error. My case would need to be irrefutable. When my baby bump finally became unmistakable, Derek made his first attempt at contact since abandoning me at the resort. The message was lengthy, saccharine-laced with feigned contrition and platitudes about putting our difficulties behind us. But the underlying message was unmistakable. He and Evelyn were growing desperate to regain control. I was tempted, for a fleeting moment, to respond with a blistering rebuke and lay my cards on the table. But that would merely sacrifice my advantage while accomplishing nothing. So I remained silent and kept building my case. As expected, their efforts escalated from there. Evelyn's flying monkeys sniffed around my parents' home a few times until I was forced to relocate again. I caught strangers furtively trying to snap pictures of me on the street, no doubt seeking ammunition to support claims of my unfitness. The final straw came when a bulky man shoved an expired court summons into my hands outside the Ob-Gyn clinic following a checkup. The paper was meaningless, a fabricated ruse to rattle me, but it revealed just how far they were willing to go. If I didn't strike first, there was no limit to the damage they'd try to inflict when the baby arrived, which is why I swallowed my trepidation and sought out the best family law firm in the state. Sitting across from that cool-eyed senior partner, I finally laid out the entire sordid truth for the first time, holding nothing back. To their credit, the attorneys mastered their revulsion at the more horrific details, absorbing it all with clinical detachment. But I could see the calculated gears turning as they recognized the unbridled legal firestorm this case could unleash. Less than 48 hours later, Evelyn and Derek were slapped with a temporary restraining order and barrage of subpoenas, clawing back years of financial data, communications, and records pertaining to their corrosive scheme. The element of surprise was complete. They never saw it coming. When Derek frantically called to plead his case, I savored every syllable of his desperate, impotent blubbering. I imagined his mother going into conniptions, her deranged sense of entitlement crumbling. And in that moment I pitied them both in a way. Evelyn's scorched-earth parenting, her vitriolic need to control those around her, had ultimately transformed her into precisely the monster unleashed upon me. And Derek's Faustian bargain had shackled him to that all-consuming toxicity. But pity is a grace they never once afforded me. The coming year would see my own hardships escalate in ways I could scarcely fathom. A new mother fighting tooth and nail, both as a protective parent and an impassioned legal combatant. But thanks to my resolve and strategic groundwork, I held the high ground. It was only a matter of time before karma inserted the final pieces to bring Derek and Evelyn's depraved ambition to its kneecap, and I would be lying if I said I didn't plan to savor every last minute. The months following my preemptive legal strike were a grinding gauntlet of litigation and personal attacks. Derek and Evelyn responded to my bombshell lawsuit with a vengeance, churning out lies and false allegations rapid fire. Fortunately, my own airtight documentation blunted the worst of their smear campaign. Still, having to counter increasingly outlandish claims about everything from faking my pregnancy to suffering from mental instability took a grueling toll. I was utterly drained by the time I finally gave birth to my son, Liam. That first moment, cradling his squirming little form, tears of joy and relief streaming down my face, remains the purest memory from that entire nightmare, uncorrupted by the toxicity swirling around us. For a few fleeting days, I allowed myself to soak in the splendor of new motherhood, letting the lingering stresses recede into the background. I knew the reprieve was temporary, but I selfishly safeguarded those moments as long as I could. The bubble burst when I was served with Derek's motion for emergency custody. The paperwork read like Evelyn's manifesto regurgitated in legalese, complete with florid claims that I had effectively kidnapped Liam and posed a danger to him unless he was immediately removed from my care. My own attorneys assured me the motion was little more than a delayed intimidation tactic aimed at sabotaging my case momentum. Still, I couldn't shake the bone-deep fear of having my infant son wrested from my arms. My dread only escalated when our first courtroom showdown landed me face-to-face with Derek and Evelyn once again. Their snarling contempt hit me like a physical force as the vitriol began spewing. "This pathetic fantasy has gone on quite long enough," Evelyn proclaimed with a dismissive sneer. "We tried putting you on the path to redemption, but you insist on resisting to the detriment of my grandson. This is no life for a child." I fought to keep my breathing steady, struggling against the instinct to lash out. My attorneys had prepped me extensively on not rising to their verbal baits. Derek took the baton, his glowering expression more hangdog than threatening. Just let us bring Liam home where he belongs, Lena, with people who actually care about giving him a stable life. Not whatever this is. He made a vague, disparaging gesture which caused Evelyn to tut loudly in disgust. The well-choreographed good cop, bad cop routine was so transparent, so patently patronizing after all we had endured. Do you ever stop to hear the deranged vitriol dribbling from your own mouths? I said at last, adrenaline emboldening me. We both know this has never truly been about Liam's well-being. It's about controlling anything and everything around you until it bends to your twisted demands. Evelyn started, her mouth working furiously as she prepared to unleash another volley of abuse. But the judge's stern gavel cut her off with an irritated clap. Mrs. Bowen, that's more than enough, His Honor intoned firmly. No further outbursts or I'll have the bailiffs remove you. Fuming, Evelyn subsided into seething silence. Derek appeared to shrink slightly, chastened by his failed ploy. For perhaps the first time in his life, he seemed to register just how frail their position had become. It was the first small but unmistakable shift in momentum, the start of their unraveling before an increasingly skeptical legal system. I left that day's proceedings holding Liam a little tighter, bolstered by the knowledge that their persecution was cracking at long last. There would undoubtedly be more horrors to come before the final rulings. But like an offshore storm finally breaking, I sensed their dark era of control over our lives had finally reached its apex. Soon, everything they'd sown through deceit and malice would begin reaping its most profound consequence. And this time, there would be no more mercy from me, not after the depravities they'd inflicted on me and my child. This time, they would answer for it all and know true karma. The culmination finally arrived nearly a year to the day after my desperate escape from that nightmare resort getaway Evelyn had orchestrated. All the discovery maneuvering, pre-trial posturing, and failed sideshow motions led to this. A final, protracted court battle that would decide the fates of everyone involved. Derek and Evelyn's smugness had steadily eroded with each rebuffed attempt to regain leverage, but their defiance remained obstinate. I had to hand it to them. They played their losing hand with a zeal that bordered on delusional. When we entered the courthouse on that crisp October morning, Evelyn turned to sneer at me with her customary disdain. Enjoy this circus while it lasts, you ungrateful shrew. Soon, the decent, stable world I've fought to preserve for my grandson will be restored. I said nothing, unwilling to justify her provocation with a response. My sole focus was getting Liam situated with the court-appointed guardian who would be supervising him throughout the grueling proceedings. The trial itself was every bit as drawn-out and emotionally grueling as expected. Evelyn's legal team launched salvo after salvo of character attacks, revisiting every perceived maternal shortcoming in grandiose detail. I sat stoically through it all, following my own attorney's impeccable guidance. I knew their scattershot smears wouldn't connect with the jurors, not with the overwhelming documentation and testimony we had marshaled. When it was finally time for me to take the stand, there was an unmistakable sense of shift in the courtroom atmosphere. 12 pairs of eyes followed my every measured movement, all preliminary biases and assumptions giving way to rapt attention. From there, I simply talked. Spoke plainly and honestly about the nightmare I'd endured at the hands of Derek and his venomous mother. I recounted the lies and manipulations in granular detail, leaving nothing out, no matter how unsavory. Evelyn thrashed indignantly at times until the judge threatened her with contempt. Derek sat motionless, eyes downcast, vaguely reminiscent of those first fitful moments when his self-delusions began cracking. I don't know how long I held the jury enthralled, but by the time I was let off the stand, there could be no ambiguity about the profound impact my testimony had made. Several jurors wore expressions of dismay and disbelief. They had witnessed evil firsthand. Derek and Evelyn's subsequent attempts to redeem their case took on a rote hollowness after that. Neither mustered any believable passion for their fabricated narratives, as if some deep part of them had finally acknowledged their descent into self-parody. The final blow landed when forensic accountants took the stand and meticulously detailed the RICO-laden financial fraud underpinning Evelyn's ill-fated business. Investment, my family's hard-earned life savings ruthlessly squandered. After that, the jury's deliberations were little more than a formality. In the end, I was awarded full custody of Liam as well as a substantial multi-million-dollar judgment against Evelyn and her syndicate of grifters. Derek's reputation and future career prospects were summarily annihilated. It was a complete legal massacre on a scale of humiliation even I had not foreseen. While I relished the delicious karmic karma of the moment, there was no sense of elation or relief when the verdicts came down. My gaze lingered on Derek as his pallid, haggard expression registered the devastating finality of it all. A grown man rendered infantile and broken on the altar of one woman's monstrous obsession with control. I thought maybe a shred of remorse might flicker across his face, some profound regret for having sacrificed everything to his mother's malignant influences. But his stare remained blank and empty, 2 decades of brainwashing too entrenched to ever overcome. "Have your victory, then, you spiteful witch," Evelyn hissed vehemently at me, mercifully concluding her reign of terror with one last sputtering outburst as the bailiffs led her away. "We'll see how long your house of lies stands when the truth about you inevitably surfaces." As the courtroom finally cleared out, I pulled Liam close and pressed my lips to the crown of his downy head. Looking into those innocent, adoring eyes, I knew I had emerged victorious. But it was a victory wrought from desperation and hardship, a rite of fire that had steeled me with an alloy resilience. No further vindictiveness or bitterness remained, only a bone-deep resolve to shepherd my son's life towards promise, at long last unshackled from Evelyn's corrosive reach. The ordeal had remade me, uncompromised and finely honed, to ensure Liam's future would be one of compassion and selfless purpose, and that would be the realest, most enduring justice of all.
Elizabeth is my name. I've spent a significant portion of my life teaching Italian, so at 42 I was essentially set in my ways, comfortable, if you will, with the monotonous buzz of chalk dust and school bells. But something happened to me. It wasn't a dramatic change of events, more like when you saw someone across a busy room and you just knew something significant was going to happen. It was a typical dreary March afternoon when I met Marco. Isabella, his daughter, was one of my private pupils. She was a bright kid who was always enthusiastic and always completed her schoolwork on time. That day, when Marco entered my classroom to pick her up, she was busy writing in her notebook. He stood awkwardly at the door and said, "I apologize for barging in like this." The wind had messed up his hair, and his coat was leaking all over the place. "Don't worry at all." With a comforting smile, I answered, "We're just wrapping up. Isabella just completed a workout." With a nod, Marco leaned against the doorframe and observed us. "She mentions you frequently, says you make education enjoyable." I laughed and put my books down. I make an effort. Italian is a lovely language. Don't you think it deserves a little ardor? He shrugged, a tiny smile flashing on his lips. "Yeah, I guess. It's Marco, incidentally." Reaching out, I said, "Elizabeth," talking excitedly about the class and how much she was looking forward to the next one. Isabella packed her luggage. Marco listened, his gaze darting from mine to her lively face. He was obviously a loving father. Marco hesitated as they were ready to walk away. "Hey, this weekend there's a small community get-together with food, music, and a laid-back vibe if you're free. Would you mind attending the celebration and bringing a little of that Italian fervor with you?" I was surprised not only by the invitation, but also by how simple it was. "Yes, of course. It seems enjoyable." "Fantastic. Then it's a date," he said a little too soon. "You know, just a friendly outing, not like a date night." I laughed, removing some of the uneasiness. "Got it. A get-together excursion." Marco revealed a little more about himself over plates of food during our first official outing, as the community band performed some classic songs and children ran around. He stated, "You know, I'm a widower," in a somewhat gravelly and lower-pitched voice. Isabella and her brother, Matteo, have been raised by me alone. 12 years old, quite the dynamite. I nodded, feeling sorry for him and unsure of what to say. It sounds like you're quite busy. Yes, it has been difficult, but we make it work, he said, prodding at his meal. They make it easier. They're good kids. Our talks became more in-depth over the following few days. We strolled through parks and gathered at little cafes. I got to know Matteo on these walks, a vibrant youngster with his father's eyes and a contagious giggle. He instantly warmed up to me, asking about Italy, and showed me his sketches. Marco then gave me a tour of his mother. Her grin was kind, but her tongue was sharp. She was a stout woman. Glancing up at me, but not in an insulting way, she added, "So you're the lovely lady making my son smile again." Happy he found someone to tolerate his culinary prowess. I didn't carefully deliberate on joining a new family. Instead, it kind of happened and unfolded as if it was meant to be. Things started to grow serious after I had been seeing Marco for a long. Before I realized it, I had become more than simply his girlfriend. I had become an important part of his and his children's lives. We decided it was time for me to move in one Saturday morning. Stuffing my life into boxes felt appropriate, yet odd. I was assisted by Marco and the children in moving my belongings into their house, which would soon become our home. As he hefted in yet another bulky box marked "Books," Marco remarked, "Hope you've got room for all these books. I'm going to build a library in the backyard, so better make room." As we wandered around the living room, trying to figure out where everything would fit, I shot back, laughing. Both Matteo and Isabella were excited as they showed me their rooms and potential places for me to store some of my belongings. "If you would like, you can place some items on my shelf," Matteo said, gesturing to his disorganized bookcase that was brimming with vintage comic books and model cars. "Many thanks, Matteo," I said, ruffling his hair. "Maybe I'll just add a few books and leave room for your cars." The true test came when I moved in and got to know Rosa, Marco's mother. That afternoon, she approached with a pleasant tone while her eyes followed every move. She observed me setting up the kitchen and said, "So you're setting up shop here now, huh?" "Indeed, Rosa." Declaring it official, I said, not knowing how much of the space I was able to claim as mine. "Remember that Marco prefers his eggs over easy, not scrambled," she stated matter-of-factly, but with a gleam in her eye. "I'll keep that in mind," I smiled, appreciating her mix of humor and directness. Living together meant adjusting a lot of it. Marco worked long hours, and I found myself spending more time with Matteo and Isabella. I helped them with homework, we cooked meals together, and gradually I wasn't just Elizabeth anymore. I was a part of their daily routine. It wasn't all smooth sailing. There were days when I felt like I was stepping on toes, overstepping unseen boundaries. But for every awkward moment, there were a dozen others filled with laughter and shared secrets. We were finding our rhythm, slow and steady. Marco and I had our moments too, learning about each other in ways only possible when you share a space. "You know you make this place better," Marco said one night as we sat on the couch, exhausted from the day. "I just want you guys to feel like it's still your home," I said, my head resting on his shoulder. Becoming a stepmom wasn't easy. There were no guidelines or rule books. But as I fell asleep that night, listening to the quiet hum of the house, I knew this was where I was meant to be. It was chaotic, messy, and absolutely perfect in its own imperfect way. In that moment, that was enough. Rosa and I used to have the best times together before the stroke changed everything. She'd come over, and we'd spend hours in the kitchen, sharing recipes and gossiping like old friends. Those days filled the house with laughter and the warm aromas of Italian dishes we both loved to cook. But life, as it does, took a sharp turn when Rosa was paralyzed. Everything shifted. Marco moved her into her home, and naturally I stepped up to take care of her. It seemed like the right thing to do. She was family after all. However, Marco's help was strangely absent. I thought maybe he was just overwhelmed with work, but as days turned into weeks, his distance grew more noticeable. Caring for Rosa was a full-time job. She needed help with everything, and I did it all without a second thought, clinging to the warmth we once shared. But her condition seemed to harden her a bit, and our light chats turned into functional conversations. "Did you add the basil to the sauce?" Rosa would ask sharply, watching me from her wheeled chair as I cooked. "Yes, just like you taught me," I'd respond, trying to catch her eye and maybe spark a smile. But smiles were hard to come by those days. As time went on, Marco and I spoke less and less. One night, I tried to bridge the gap. "Marco, we hardly talk anymore. Is everything okay?" He was silent for a moment, then his words cut through the air. "I'm just tired, Elizabeth. It's been a lot, dealing with everything." I nodded, feeling a chill. His eyes didn't meet mine. The disconnect between us was palpable, but I pushed it aside, focusing on Rosa and the kids. Years passed, and Rosa's presence in the house became the new normal, until her death. It was sudden, despite everything, and the funeral was a blur of black dresses, somber faces, and whispered condolences. But the real shock came after the funeral, when Marco's true feelings spilled out during an argument. "You're just here taking up space now, Elizabeth. I only put up with you because you were useful. But look at you. What use are you now?" His words were like slaps, leaving me stunned. "Marco, how can you say that after all these years?" "It's the truth, Elizabeth. You were here for the kids and my mother. That's it." He turned away, dismissing me with a wave of his hand. The kids, now practically adults, started showing their true colors too. Isabella, once sweet and friendly, became cold and cruel. "You really have no one, Elizabeth. You're just here because we pity you," she'd say, her words dripping with disdain. Matteo wasn't any kinder. "Why are you still hanging around? You're just taking up space." He'd sneer whenever we crossed paths in the hallway. Their words, their rejection, gnawed at me daily. I felt isolated in the very home I had poured my heart into. The family I loved and cared for had turned against me, seeing me as nothing more than a temporary fixture, now obsolete. One evening I was setting the dinner table, hoping for a quiet meal when Marco walked in, his face like a storm cloud. "Why are you still trying to play happy families, Elizabeth? You know it's all a show," he snapped as he threw his keys on the table. I paused, my hands trembling slightly as I placed the last fork down. "I don't understand, Marco. Why are you so angry with me?" "You were part of the setup, like furniture, useful for a time, and now just taking up space," he retorted, opening the fridge and staring into it as if it held the answers to more than just his hunger. I stood there silent, trying to process his harsh words. The room felt like it was closing in on me. Isabella and Matteo came in, their faces mirroring their father's disdain. Matteo grabbed a soda from the fridge, his eyes mocking. "Yeah, Elizabeth, maybe you should just accept it. You're like an old couch we should have thrown out ages ago." Isabella laughed, a harsh sound that filled the room. "Seriously, Elizabeth, even you have to see it's true. You're just the leftovers now." Their cruelty sliced through any defense I had left. I turned away, hiding the tears that threatened to fall. "I've cared for you all, loved you. How can you treat me like this?" Marco shrugged, dismissing my emotions with a wave of his hand. "Love? That's a strong word for just doing your job, don't you think?" The rest of the dinner passed in silence, at least on my part. Their words echoed in my head. Leftovers, useless old furniture. It was clear they saw me as nothing more than a temporary help that had overstayed her welcome. Life has a way of knocking you down when you least expect it. Just when I thought things couldn't get worse, my health took a nosedive. My legs, which had always carried me through long days of teaching and bustling about the house, suddenly became a source of constant pain. The doctors couldn't give me a straight answer at first, tossing around terms like chronic inflammation and possible degenerative issues, which meant little more than get used to it. This change hit me like a brick. Teaching at the private school, a job I cherished and excelled at, became impossible. I had to resign, leaving behind not just my income, but a part of my identity. At home, every step was a struggle, every task a monumental effort. I felt trapped in my own body, and worse, in a home where I was increasingly unwelcome. Marco's reaction to my situation was like a cold splash of reality. One morning, after I had struggled to clear up the breakfast dishes, grimacing with every move, he walked into the kitchen. He watched me for a moment, his face twisted not with concern but irritation. "Why are you even trying to clean? You're just making a mess," he said, his voice cold and sharp. "I'm trying to help out, Marco. It's not like I can just sit around," I replied, leaning against the counter for support. "Help? You call that help? You're more of a burden now than anything," he shot back, his words slicing through the air and cutting me deeper than the pain in my legs. Marco and the kids spent money like water, flaunting new gadgets and designer clothes bought with the inheritance. Me? I got nothing, not that I expected anything different at this point. Their lavish spending was a slap in the face, a constant reminder of where I stood in this family. On top of that, Marco and the kids loved to remind me that I was only in their house out of pity. "Don't push your luck, Elizabeth," Marco would sneer. "Remember, you're just one argument away from being out on the street." Their words were like a cage, locking me in a life of quiet desperation. But one day I stumbled upon a website for private tutors teaching languages online. My heart raced as I explored the possibility of teaching Italian again, reconnecting with a part of myself that I thought was lost forever. I dove into setting up my profile, my fingers trembling with excitement as I typed out my experience and qualifications: experienced Italian teacher, personalized and engaging lessons. Before long, I was booking my first session. The thrill of teaching, of speaking Italian, of engaging with eager students, it all came rushing back, filling me with a warmth I hadn't felt in years. Each day, as Marco and the kids left, I transformed a corner of my room into a makeshift classroom. I started with a few students, but word of mouth spread fast. My schedule filled up, and I found myself teaching more and more. "You're really good at this, Elizabeth," a student told me over a video call, their words bolstering my confidence. I started receiving glowing reviews, and my rates went up. As my reputation grew, so did my earnings. It was astounding. For the first time in a long time, I was making my own money, more money than Marco even. But I kept this to myself. If Marco or his kids knew, they'd surely find a way to claim it or ruin this for me. One afternoon, after a particularly rewarding session, I sat back and let out a long, satisfied sigh. Just then, Marco walked in earlier than usual. He eyed my setup: a laptop, notebooks, Italian flags, and teaching aids scattered around. "What's all this?" he asked, his tone suspicious. "I'm teaching," I replied, my voice steady and calm despite my racing heart. "Teaching here." His confusion was evident. He hadn't expected this. "Who would want to learn from you?" "People from all over the world," I responded with pride. I couldn't hide. "Turns out I'm quite popular." Marco scoffed, clearly unimpressed. "Make sure this doesn't interfere with your chores around the house." "It won't," I assure him, turning back to my computer. His presence in my sanctuary irked me, but he soon left, muttering under his breath. That night I lay in bed, a smile playing on my lips. Marco and his kids could spend all the inheritance they wanted on fleeting pleasures. Meanwhile, I was building something lasting, something just for me. My online teaching wasn't just a job, it was my lifeline, my escape plan. I was no longer just the downtrodden stepmother. I was Elizabeth, the sought-after Italian tutor, a woman with a plan and a growing bank account. That night at dinner, there was a tension in the air so thick you could almost see it hanging above the table. Marco and the kids were unusually quiet as I served the food, their eyes avoiding mine. I could feel something brewing beneath the surface, but nothing prepared me for the words that were about to slice through the last threads of our family ties. Marco was the first to break the silence, his voice cold and detached. "I got a promotion at work," he announced, not looking at anyone in particular. "I bought a new house, too." I paused, spoon midair, the news catching me off guard. "That's great. Congratulations," I managed to say, though a sinking feeling started to form in my stomach. "Yeah, well, don't get too excited," Marco continued, his eyes now fixed on me with a hardness I hadn't seen before. "You're not coming with us." I put the spoon down, feeling suddenly like I had been punched in the gut. "What do you mean?" "Just what I said." Marco snapped. "You're not part of the plan, Elizabeth. You stay here. I'm moving with the kids. We need a fresh start." The room spun slightly as his words sunk in. Isabella giggled cruelly from across the table, her voice like a knife. "Yeah, who needs an old limping maid in a shiny new house?" Matteo chimed in with a smirk. "Consider yourself lucky we're not kicking you out on the street tonight." I looked from face to face, each one a mask of contempt and dismissal. My heart pounded painfully in my chest. "And the house? This house?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "It's sold," Marco said bluntly. "New owners will take over in a month. Maybe try to find a shelter or something by then." They all laughed, a harsh, grating sound that filled the room. I sat there stunned, my hands trembling in my lap. This was their thanks, their repayment for all the years of care, of love, of sacrifice. As the laughter died down, I found my voice, small but steady. "I see. Well then, I guess there's nothing left to say, is there?" Marco shrugged, already disinterested, as he turned his attention back to his plate. "Guess not." I stood up, my legs shaky but holding. I looked at each of them, their faces still turned toward their food, no sign of remorse or regret. "Enjoy your dinner," I said quietly, then turned and left the room. In my room, the gravity of the situation hit me full force. They were really going to leave me behind, discard me like an old piece of furniture. But as I sat there, a strange sense of relief began to wash over me. I was free from their cruelty, their disdain, their oppressive presence. It was not the freedom I had imagined or wanted, but it was freedom nonetheless. The day I left Marco and his children behind, I felt a strange mix of liberation and deep sadness as I held my last suitcase to the door. Marco's bitter words followed me. "Hope you enjoy the flop houses because that's all you can afford," he jeered with a cruel laugh that echoed off the empty walls. His kids, Isabella and Matteo, joined in with their own barbs. "Good riddance. Now we don't have to deal with your pathetic limping around the house." I didn't bother to reply. What was the point? I had learned long ago that words were useless against their kind of cruelty. I walked out, letting the door slam shut behind me, shutting off the chapter of my life that had brought me so much pain. Moving into the apartment I had rented in secret felt like the first true breath of fresh air in years. It was a modest place, but it was mine alone. Here no shadows of disdain would loom over me. No harsh words would cut through the quiet. Setting up my new home was therapeutic. I arranged my books and set up my small desk by the window, the new headquarters for my online Italian lessons. I relished the peace, the utter silence that came not from tension, but from tranquility. The divorce was finalized soon after. I stood in the courtroom facing Marco and his children for the last time. They smirked, confident and unrepentant. When offered alimony, I refused. I want nothing from him. Not now, not ever, I declared. He and his children are strangers to me. Word of my teaching spread, and my schedule became packed with students from all corners of the globe. The income was more than sufficient, a sweet victory that was all my own. One evening, while sipping tea at my new kitchen table, a call from an old friend brought unexpected news. "Have you heard about Marco?" she asked, a tone of disbelief in her voice. "He's moving into a fancy new house, but guess what? He's already blowing through money like there's no tomorrow." I couldn't help but grin, shaking my head. "No surprise there," I replied. "He never did plan for the future." Rumors about Marco and his children's reckless spending didn't surprise me, but it was the catalyst I needed to put my plan into action. During the last few tumultuous months of our marriage, I had recorded several of their verbal tirades and cruel jabs, originally for my own records in case I ever needed proof of their behavior. I sent the files anonymously to Marco's boss. The company he worked for had a strict policy against any form of harassment, and I knew they would take it seriously. Before long, the consequences became apparent. My phone rang one evening and it was Marco's number. I was hesitant to respond, but my curiosity won out and I did. You could hear the anguish in his voice. "Elizabeth, what have you done?" he shouted out, sounding terrified and angry at the same time. "So you've heard? Sounds like your employer didn't value the way you handle people," I stated coolly, my words tinged with a little satisfaction. "You have destroyed me. They reduced my pay and demoted me. Now how am I going to pay the mortgage?" He yelled. We could lose the house, with a hint of fear in his voice. Isabella and Matteo were talking loudly and accusingly in the background, and they were criticizing me the same way they always did. "Elizabeth, you're to blame for everything. This will cost you money." Over the phone, Matteo's voice could be heard. I had to laugh, really laugh, a real chuckle that had been missing for far too long. "You might wind up living in a dump. Is it not ironic?" "Irony not lost on me," I said. "Help us, Elizabeth, please. We apologize. None of it was intended by us. We'll take all action necessary," Marco begged, his voice cracking with desperation. "Marco, you just don't get it. I don't need your assistance or an apology." I snapped back. "I'm beyond being your punching bag and maid." "But we're family," he attempted one last time. I corrected him icily. We were family, and felt a wave of empowerment wash over me. "Goodbye, Marco." I hung up the phone, blocking Matteo's and Isabella's numbers as well as his. A weight lifted from my shoulders, providing me with closure I was unaware I was lacking. A few weeks later, I received word from mutual contacts that Marco and his kids had indeed been evicted for non-payment of their mortgage. The kids, who are now adults, had to find employment to support themselves, and they had to drastically reduce. I smiled at the thought of them struggling to make ends meet while I was thinking about purchasing a home of my own. It was about justice, about proving to them that I was no longer the person they could walk all over, not just about getting even. I returned my focus to my computer and saw a note from a pupil expressing gratitude for my motivational lectures. It made my heart feel warm. Nobody could take away from me the sense of belonging and purpose I had discovered.